is a mobile health and telemedicine implementation. It's a pilot project with the Millennium Villages project in partnership with Ericsson and Medgate, which is a Swiss telemedicine group. But instead of sort of going in there and trying to do something, we essentially have taken this very stepwise process where in September we did a feasibility study at the national, regional, district, and the Millennium Village level to figure out what the local capabilities were, what people were already doing in terms of consultation, referral, et cetera, and the types of things that would feed into these sorts of systems. And we figured we still didn't have enough information to really develop a project management design process and or the software applications that would be needed to drive this. And so we hosted a participatory design workshop a few weeks ago where we pulled together key stakeholders from the national level, regional level, district level, local community. We had community health workers there that were involved in informing the process, both looking at what the overall strategy should be for the project and what the objectives should be, but then also looking at what the software design implications would be as well. And the way the workshop was set up was the first day, a lot of information sharing. The Ministry of Health got up and shared what they were doing with technology. Ghana Health Service stood up and shared their things. A bunch of NGOs came out and shared what they were doing. And then the next 2 days, through working groups, et cetera, we pulled together a design document for what this project is going to look like, and identified all the interoperability issues where the gaps were in both hardware and software design, and then how it feeds into the overall national health system strategies and objectives of the Ghana Health Service, and then what policies as well needed to be developed and what guidelines needed to be developed from ethical standpoint and legal issues to then sort of support that system. And it was incredibly well received. The directors of the Ghana Health Service and the Ministry of Health are now looking into, because they sort of saw it as a first step towards developing a national e-health policy for Ghana. And so they're going to sort of use this as a step in that direction.
Are there others of you that have done sort of user-centric design processes to really look at, as opposed to the MIT, notwithstanding the smartness of MIT students, but, and I love them dearly, and I just taught a class there, but a lot of times the solutions or the ideas that come out of the lab are not necessarily what works in the field. John?
So some of our engineers have been working on an application for community healthcare workers in Tanzania for the last couple of months out of our office in Boston. And there's a Fulbright researcher in Tanzania who's been interfacing with Patty's group and others working on building a coalition of community healthcare workers who can actually test the application. And I talked to the programmers as soon as they flew to Tanzania, and after day one, they were like, we programmed everything wrong. So an example of that was we had this really interesting search interface for finding patients. And we spent a lot of time thinking about algorithms for finding the patients and how to do text search. And the community healthcare worker took one look at it and said, why don't you just make this look like the Nokia contact list? Because that's what everybody's used to using. And we're like, that's really smart. Why didn't we do that? So we threw out weeks worth of work that we had done after about 5 minutes of somebody demoing the application. And the key takeaway from that was the experience that one gets on the ground by building these local research networks and these local usability participants is worth a lot of expatriate developer days in terms of cost, which means it's incredibly cost effective to spend a lot of money on projects, making sure that you have your users from day one who can help you build your application, help you test it time and time again. And we actually make this mistake with every project we do, so I'm not sure that this advice goes very far, but it's really almost immeasurable how much value add that has for the success of your project and the ROI you get by investing early in first finding your user base and making sure you have a consistent user base that you can constantly test your software out on.
Ladders. I walked in late to this, so I'm not quite sure of the context, but I saw designer designs, so I threw my hand up.
We'll fill you in very shortly. So, by the way.
Okay, so the experiences that we've had with it are twofold. About a year ago, we started working with the OECD on redesigning their .stat interface, not for their entire organization, but for their development arm. And we pulled in a couple of people initially that were coming in from the user experience and the usability side, and went through a fairly quick process, actually. It took about a month or two to go out and identify the overall vision for the project, the stakeholders, who the potential end users of the systems were. And in going through that process, I think the OECD learned a couple of things. One, we found out very quickly that we could have built the system for the sort of power user, the person who really wanted to get in there, knew their data very strongly, and would actually likes to go in and run SQL on their databases. And from that, we've identified that that was actually a negative group that we weren't trying to build for. So we could have gone off and spent a lot of money if we hadn't done this initial research to figure out who the different user groups were that we were trying to build towards, and figure out what it is that they needed, how they interacted with the system, what it is that they wanted to pull out of it at the end of it. So I think, kind of speaking to what you were saying there a second ago, we saved a lot of money. We could have gone off. Software developers like to create things. We could have spent, run up through $1 million budget fairly quickly creating this very complicated interface, when really what we found out from the end users, what they needed, and then once we identified that, we could go off.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sorry, there's one point I forgot that always blows my mind every time it happens to us again and again. It's not sufficient to have a local group that's testing your software remotely. You have to watch them do it. The reason for that is the culture of the people who are typically our end users, so nurses, doctors, community healthcare workers, they assume that we knew what we were doing when we wrote the software, and it's their fault if they can't figure out how to use it. So even if I send the application to them, they test it, they're going to tell me it's perfect and nothing's wrong with it. And then when I go actually watch them use it, I'm going to realize I made their life 10 times harder than it had to be. And so it's completely insufficient to find a group of people who will test it in a vacuum without somebody on your team watching them use it, because they're not going to tell you did it wrong. That's just not the way that people give feedback with the groups that we've worked with, at least. And so it's really, really important to get people who are watching them use it, watching them screw up, realizing how you designed it incorrectly.
So I'm curious, yeah, and I was going to call you, but I'm actually curious how many of you have developed some sort of a methodology, which good technology designers do, in terms of focusing on your users, a sort of user-centric design process that is actually documented in some way. Presumably you have a curriculum for the design. Presumably you guys have.
We've got our kind of innovation lab strategy.
Is there a documented process, though, that you could actually share? In other words, if you have something shareable,
actually.
John, you guys?
Yeah.
Does Damagi have, you guys have a sort of a documented design? Here's how you think about this from a user point of view. So raise your hand if you have a shareable document at this point. Hi. Okay, you're all going to put that on the wiki, right? Okay.